Welcome once again to Targeted, where we pull back the curtain on unchecked power gone off the rails. I'm Zach Abramowitz, and I want to drag you deeper still into the depths of corporate corruption with a conclusion to the saga of the whistleblower who took the lid off his employer's dirty deeds. He did his level best to break free of the company's grasp, and yet little did he realize his troubles were only beginning. In part 2 of the trials of Jonathan Taylor. Last time on Targeted, we heard how Jonathan Taylor, a successful lawyer at SBM Offshore, uncovered a massive bribery scandal. He quietly reported the corruption to the SEC and eventually left SBM. But when the company came under fire, Jonathan fired back, assisting investigations in Brazil and the US. His efforts helped secure nearly $1 billion in fines and multiple prison sentences. That should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. Instead, this is where the real targeting began. The fight got personal. Despite suffering devastating losses, SBM refused to back down. In 2014, SBM reported Jonathan to the Monaco prosecutor's office for extortion. The following year, they sued him for defamation in the Netherlands, only to withdraw the case before trial. In 2017, Jonathan strikes back, now pushing for a Dutch court to question SBM executives he believed had covered up the corruption, including Sietze Hepkema, the same executive whose email had infuriated Jonathan to the point of no return. 2 years later, an Amsterdam appeals court finally gave Jonathan his day in court. The executives were forced to testify, but Jonathan claims Hepkema lied under oath. For a moment, it seemed like Jonathan might finally be free of SBM's grasp. But then in 2020, things took a turn for the worst. Did you have any schadenfreude? Like, how did when you saw SBM start to get in trouble, did you feel any sense of personal vendetta that you had achieved? They had harmed you. They had hurt your livelihood. By your account, now you were able to get them back.
I had no idea of the consequences of that posting. I had no clue. So much so that I thought it was over and done with the same evening that I put it up. I had no idea.
It was the angry email that you wrote but you never sent, but it turns out you did send it.
Except it was a very
public,
relatively sophisticated 8-page summary of the sins of the company. So ultimately, I had no idea what the repercussions were going to be. As it happened, I suddenly became Mr. Popular by a fair few public prosecutors, national public prosecutors, who saw the quote article, saw they were able to click on the article to see the full extent of this revelation. They sued me for defamation. So in the legal world, it's known as a SLAPP, a strategic lawsuit against public participation. So
they weren't going to win it, but at least they could get the idea out there that he's lying.
Typically the domain of oligarchs going against the individual, not the publishing company, just to shut them up. So the defamation, the whole point of that, so the company could tell its partners, its clients, its employees, its banks, this Taylor, the guy, don't listen to him. We've
sued him, defamation
proceedings for defamation. What he's saying is clearly not the truth, and you should take a wide berth. Don't let it worry you. It's okay, Mr. Bank. It's okay. We're all in line with our covenants. So nothing came of that. I filed a defence. They reduced the claim to zero, a nihil application. It's a Dutch legal tool, and the matter went away. It was dismissed by the court. I wasn't given my day in court. So that was back in 2015, but before that, they managed to get a freezing order over my house, a preliminary hearing that I was never even party to, and they tried to freeze my bank accounts too. So imagine imagine they'd been successful with the freezing of the bank accounts. How would you be, even if you had the cash, how are you going to pay your lawyer to defend that case?
Jonathan's legal battle was complex, but to understand what happened next, you need to understand a little bit about Interpol. Interpol is the world's largest international police organization. Based in France, Interpol's origin actually dates back to the first ever International Police Congress in 1914, in Monaco of all places. This Congress established the need for a system that allowed law enforcement around the globe to share information, training, and resources to combat transnational criminal enterprises. One of the tools at Interpol's disposal is its system of notices. Any of its 196 member countries can submit a notice about an individual or an organization that alerts authorities in all other member nations that a certain action is requested against that subject. The most egregious is a red notice. A red notice requests the arrest and eventual extradition of someone a member nation has accused of a crime. Interpol can withdraw these notices if it deems they are requested as acts of reprisal against political dissidents, for example. But to better understand why these red notices so often become part of targeting campaigns, I spoke with Jonathan's lawyer, Toby Cadman. He's become something of an expert on red notices, having challenged Interpol in numerous cases.
What we have seen recently, certainly as far as Interpol is concerned, there have been very real concerns raised as to how it operates, whether it is an independent, impartial system, a neutral body as it was set up to be. And we have seen that there are attempts to reform Interpol. One of the biggest problems with Interpol in particular is the concept that it's very easy to get somebody on the system, to get a red notice issued. It's very difficult to take it off. And the level of bureaucracy and the amount of time it takes, even if a warrant has been issued improperly, and when warrants are issued improperly, Interpol does respond, it does act, and it does amend those prior decisions. But that can take a year, 2 years, 3 years in some cases. And unfortunately, the damage is then done, because effectively what a state does that's targeting an individual, they will file a set of charges. They'll get a local judge to issue a domestic arrest warrant that it then falls into an international arrest warrant, which is then issued. And regardless of whether that warrant is subsequently withdrawn, they will then use that as part of a virulent, aggressive press campaign to target that individual through the media that causes significant damage to reputation, which can never be restored. It's not that you're disclosing the entire case file to Interpol. You have to obviously provide some supporting material, but that can just be a report from a prosecutor. So it's not necessarily an evidential-based process. It was never really set up to deal with the level of abuse that we see. And you also see that certain member states that should not be entitled to access the database because of their own autocratic or dictatorial status. Syria, for example, under Bashar al-Assad, was readmitted to Interpol during the conflict. The problem that creates is not only can the Syrian regime at that time under Assad target activists, human rights activists, political opponents, but would also have full access to potential cases that are brought against members of the regime. So there are insufficient checks and balances as to who should be a member, who should access. Because you're dealing with applications on an individualized basis, there is no real system in place for a state to be penalized for providing false information. false or inaccurate information. I mean, one of the issues, of course, is oversight. Who is policing the police? Effectively, if there was an oversight mechanism, if there was an external body that you could go to make complaints, then you could have more trust and confidence in the system. I mean, that's what the CCF was set up to do, but it is an internal mechanism within Interpol, so it doesn't have sufficient independence from the global agency, and I think that's what's required. In very much in the same way at the very local level. So you have in every jurisdiction, you will have a external independent authority that is mandated to investigate and prosecute corruption within the police force. Well, that's what you need. That's what you need here. And the CCF is simply not that body.
On July 30th, 2020, while traveling to Croatia with his wife and children, Jonathan was arrested at Dubrovnik Airport. An Interpol Red Notice issued by Monaco for bribery and corruption charges was the source. He was released on bail days later, but under effective house arrest, unable to leave Croatia while waiting extradition to Monaco. SBM claimed it had nothing to do with the extradition request. Whistleblower groups weren't convinced. By October, Jonathan partially won an appeal against extradition in Croatia's Supreme Court. But 2 months later, Interpol suddenly withdrew the Red Notice. It didn't matter. Monaco wasn't done with Jonathan yet. On January 4th, 2021, the Dubrovnik County Court ruled again that Jonathan should be extradited. As you sit here retelling me this story,
Right.
does it get you worked up emotionally? I can sort of see you're upset, even like as you retell it years later at this company.
Well, we were all shocked. There had been correspondence with Monaco. They have a very close relationship, the top brass in Monaco, with SBM. They've published stamps in its honour. It was, I think it still is, the biggest private sector company by way of its employees in Monaco. The Prince Albert, would go on trade missions taking along SBM. So there was an extremely close relationship. They wanted more blue-ribboned companies to have and establish offices in Monaco. So very, very close relationship. It turned out that the prosecutor had sought an extradition of me by way of a red notice to be obviously arrested from Interpol. Thus my being arrested. So we were very surprised. I'd been on hundreds of flights since I'd left SBM. So shock was probably the best word to describe how we all felt. I was originally imprisoned for 30 days. I had 2 violent offenders and a drugs dealer in my cell. I'll never forget that door closing. Liberty having been taken away from me, I was beyond shocked, if the truth be known.
What was going through your head those first 5 days in prison?
I was in disbelief. I was trying to work out how I'd get back as quickly as possible and hopefully not lose my job, which I valued hugely. It was a great job. I wasn't able to figure out in my mind how this could possibly be allowed to happen. A major issue is to be given for a red notice to be procured by a country's prosecutor. You need to have been charged with an offence. I hadn't been. I'd been invited to see the investigating judge in Monaco on several occasions. I didn't think I'd have a fair hearing, given the proximity of Monaco with SBM. And by the way, the officers weren't 400 yards from the SBM's offices, from the prosecutor's offices.
And with the salt in the wounds that you're now being specifically accused of the thing that your former employer
Right.
was actually guilty of.
Right. And I obviously felt on the wrong end of justice. Little did I know that I was going to be there for a year.
So, and at this point, you're thinking, okay, 5 days, that must have been the worst that things are going to get. But things got worse.
So probably the single worst moment was in December. So we're talking December 2020 now. My excellent French barrister, a very well-known whistleblowing lawyer who indeed acted for Ed Snowden, amongst many others, William Bourdon, he negotiated that I could go to Monaco on the 17th of December for a meeting at 5 p.m. with the investigating judge, the very person I would have seen if the extradition that was the purpose of the Red Notice had been successful. I'd have been hauled in front of the same individual. And so that was all set up, and the idea was I'd have to stay in Monaco for maybe a follow-up interview, but I'd been assured that I'd be released and able to return to the UK for Christmas. My marriage was still intact. My job was still intact. My life was largely still intact. I had packed my bags. I was ready to go.
But
by way of protocol, the country seeking the extradition under which the Red Notice was issued has to withdraw the letter requesting the extradition from the third-party country that subject or object, myself, was in. The prosecutor refused, as far as I can tell, out of pure spite, to withdraw that request, and as a result, I had to stay in Croatia. So I was now the sort of Monaco's number one target. The BBC were heavily reporting the matter on their online pages. The stories were either about the royal family, Djokovic, the Grand Prix, or myself. And at the time, probably about half of them were about me, and it was obviously shedding a bad light, funny that, on Monaco. So I was now living at my own cost, with no income, in Zagreb. The Minister of Justice had to rubber stamp the extradition warrant that had been granted by the Supreme Court, which is in Zagreb, about 300 meters from where I lived, and that would have been the end of the matter. As it was, the minister determined I shouldn't be extradited and overruled the decision of the Supreme Court, and I was free to go. But of course, now it was all too late.
it was too late.
In terms of my life, my career, my marriage, were all in tatters.
Jonathan trusted in the rule of law, so he never saw any of this coming. And as attorney Toby Cadman notes, that's what makes the case especially troubling. The sophisticated plot against him used the international justice system to punish someone for speaking out.
And these proceedings were very, very clearly politically motivated. Anyone could see that they were politically motivated because he was a whistleblower. He blew the whistle on a corruption scheme in the hundreds of millions of dollars that resulted effectively in the collapse of a South American government, that resulted in a number of prosecutions, and he was one of the central focal points of that evidence. And he was targeted by the company that he had worked for previously that clearly had very clear connections, and were able to effectively to manipulate the process in Monaco. The other issue that we had is that the warrant was active prior to him traveling to Croatia. He'd previously traveled into France, and France chose not to activate the warrant. He traveled from the United Kingdom into France several weeks before he went to Croatia, and there was no notification that there was anything in the system clearly the French authorities would have been able to have seen that when he crossed the border, but there was no attempt to arrest him. And then it was when he arrived in Croatia on holiday with his family that he was arrested. And so the other disturbing aspect of the case is that just as we were about to have a decision, in our view, deleting the data in the Interpol system, Monaco communicated to Interpol that they withdrew the request. We believe that they withdrew the request so that there was not a decision coming out of the CCF stating that it was a politically motivated warrant targeting a whistleblower. So we have brought this to the attention of the UK authorities, both the Foreign Office and the Home Office. They almost certainly failed him. They could have prevented this. They could have acted. But one of the things that did really, really concern me was that when we raised it with the Foreign Office, and they said, well, Croatia is an independent sovereign nation. We cannot interfere with an independent judicial system. I wrote back to them and said, that is just utter nonsense. And I cited the 5 other cases that they had intervened in. And I cited in particular the case of Mohammed Nasheed, who is the former president of the Maldives, where not a British national, and I know the details because I was acting for the Maldives government in his case that he took to the United Nations Working Group on arbitrary detention. The UK government actively intervened to ensure that he was released from prison. So to say that they don't interfere with an independent judicial system is just patently untrue. They can if they choose to.
How did this, but besides the obvious, how did this put stress on your marriage, and how did you, what kind of talks did you have with your employer at this point? Because they're reading what's in the news, they're seeing the news, they're getting this. So did they immediately fire you and distance
as far as the employer's concerned, I've got no axe to grind. They'd kept the job open. They can't keep it open forever. And they kept it open from the end of July till the early next year,
but they
2021.
They were understanding.
So they were great, but obviously they couldn't carry on forever in that position. Obviously, I was away for, as I say, a year. So that position, obviously, I was terminated. I was a contractor, so basically the contract was ended.
But at this point, your life, your marriage, your family.
Right. So there was obviously immense amounts of pressure on my wife and I, and it was disastrous. It's about the end of a 25-year reunion.
Do you think the prosecutor knows, how much pain she's caused you?
I believe so. There were letters written, and I'm sure they would have read a transcript of the interrogation with the investigating judge, and there were letters written when I was still in Croatia. My Dutch lawyer, who so successfully represented me, Otto Volgenants, in the SLAPP proceedings, he'd written to SBM right at day one, almost after I'd arrived, saying, "Look, just drop the matter. It's history now. There've been no charges. They're only investigating as a result of your reporting, but of course, no possibility. I don't recognise what you're even saying in the letter."
Once the grenade has been thrown out, it's too late. It sets off a chain reaction of other investigations and...
Right. And Toby Cadman, my British barrister who represented me against Interpol, he was successful in procuring the release of the Red Notice. So on the 17th of December, it was determined that it was no longer applicable. It had been cancelled, annulled. But I was now in the system. I was now in Croatia's legal system. And the fact that the Red Notice had been withdrawn By the way, the prosecutor even denied that to their equivalents in Croatia. Made no difference. I was stuck.
Hapekma was quoted as saying, "I don't think that man will stop. He has a feud with us. We don't with him." When you heard this, how did it make you feel?
Unsurprised. In the defamation proceedings, they, in Dutch, stated that I'd brought the company to its knees. So they were seriously struggling, particularly getting financing for their projects, their miraculously won projects. And yeah, the company was in utter turmoil. Another project had gone totally pear-shaped, and they didn't pay dividends, and the company was in dire trouble. And the same individual whose quote there you just gave was the same individual who wrote that email in March 2013, which led to all that then occurred.
This is so complicated, so convoluted, so complex, so many details. How did you explain this to your children in a way that they could understand it? Could they?
But it's not that. It's not. It's a long. It's quite a tale. It's a long time span. But it's a corrupt company going up against a whistleblower, doing everything it possibly could to destroy, and that is obviously not coming from a paranoid person. That's coming from a person who to a point has been certainly taken aback by the company.
You're only paranoid if it's not true.
As a result of all that I've gone through. So yeah, that quote that doesn't surprise me in the least. I guess I was seen as some sort of betrayer who should have just shut up and let this criminal activity just be go away and be covered up, and to use Mr. Hepkins' word, to be contained. Another C word, not quite cover up, but that's what he called it. The post-traumatic stress disorder, I think it's gone. The nightmares that came with being literally strapped down in a mental institute and injected with a substance I knew not what it was, thanks to my country's Foreign Office determining that I was a suicide risk, so let's have 6 armed policemen get him and take him to hospital.
Did you consider suicide at any point during this
Obviously
fiasco?
not. But then I was allowed out 12 hours later. Not sure what the whole point of that was. That memory is now largely not reoccurring. Yeah, I mean, I was a relatively successful energy lawyer. Now I'm just longing to find things to do to spend my time. To a point, SBM Monaco have sort of won. My God, just supposing I had committed attempted extortion, which I didn't. My lawyers were dealing with their lawyers, talking about compensation. I wasn't writing with different font newspapers demanding sums of money or anything like that. But to hell, just supposing I'd have served a sentence, presumably, if I'd been found guilty of an offence and I'd be out. No obvious reason why the catastrophe that's happened to me would have occurred. I mean, I've not been the same man now since the 30th of July 2020. I'm really a shadow of the person I was. Socially, sometimes it's quite awkward. I sometimes get the impression friends, not all friends by any means, find it quite difficult to know how to handle me now, because what can they talk about? How can they, what's the latest? It's sort of embarrassing now, asking John.
Depressing even.
Slightly depressing. Certain non-friends just block me, which is quite surprising. Those that have, only a very small amount. I should stress my good friends have remained my good friends and bastions of support, but it's the others that
Where was the UK
news.
government during all of this?
I was busy helping. I was in and out the serious. They're supposed to be called the Serious Fraud Office, but they're known more like the Serious Farce Office. I was in and out their doors. Theresa May, who was then Home Secretary, had to give permission for the Brazilians to conduct an extrajudicial investigation, i.e. come to the UK to interview me. Took a year. By the way, the FBI didn't need to do that. And they interviewed me and at the SFO, and I was helping the SFO in other cases and other bribes relating to UK-based companies. I was going out of my way to helping the government via its the arm of the SFO in relation to SBM, and indeed it's managed to get the sale of the Brazilian agent who's now serving 28-year in prison in Brazil of one of his properties, and they got the proceeds of that sale. So I helped them financially. But no, when all this occurred, the arrest occurred, all the agencies I'd helped they were anonymous. They'd run a mile. That should remind you. I mean, the FBI, the Department of Justice, had closed its books on SBM. It was determined, announced in November 2014 that there was no case there for SBM. Of course, I knew the truth. And I knew damn well there were many links to the US, and I was informing the SFO about that, and they said, "Would you mind coming in and having a chat? And by the way, can we bring some people from the FBI?" And of course, they went in there. I think it was about February, March, the following year, and they reversed the decision. And decided to investigate again, and got 238 million and 3 imprisonments later. So, where was the UK government? Where was the US government? Where was the Dutch government? Where was the Swiss government? I could go on. Nowhere to be seen. No support whatsoever. Why wasn't I informed that there was a red notice? I should have been informed by the UK authorities before I even got onto that plane that there was a red notice. And how did they even know I was getting on that plane? How did the authorities get hold of the Rossiter that I was on that BA flight going to
Do you feel like
Dubrovnik?
the people that you tried to help abandoned you?
Yeah. To put it mildly, yeah. They're nowhere to be seen.
Targeted and abandoned.
Right. This is what can happen because the world simply is not ready for whistleblowers. This is the danger. I'm a shocking advert for potential whistleblowers as things stand at the moment. Yes, I live in hope things will change in terms of compensation, but as things stand at the moment, people reading my story will run a mile. Why on earth? Look what happened to Taylor. He did the right thing. Look what happened to him.
In May of 2021, struggling under the weight of his ordeal, Jonathan contacted British embassy officials, warning them about his declining mental health. Instead of receiving assistance, he says armed police arrived in the middle of the night, handcuffed him, and forcibly injected him with a sedative before taking him to a local hospital. His response? Bitter sarcasm. This was the embassy showing compassion and concern for my welfare, he later wrote. 6 months earlier, the UK Foreign Office had made it clear they weren't coming to his aid. If you could do one thing in this entire process, go back and change one thing. And I want to take you to the moment of being targeted. So everything that's happened up until then, meaning before you're arrested in 2020, we're putting that to the side. Post 2020, knowing what you know now, knowing how it would all play out, what would you tell Jonathan Taylor in 2020 to do? The Red Notice.
No, the answer is easy. The answer is easy. I should have accepted the first decision of what was the local court in Dubrovnik in September 2020 and not appealed. It would still have gone to the same minister, Ivan Malencia, who's still the Justice Minister of Croatia. And I have no reason to believe that he wouldn't have done the same, as in dismissed that decision. And then I could have been back before the end of the year, before the end of 2020.
Do you think you can ever, at this point, recover and move on to a different stage of life? What gives you hope for that prospect?
Stupidly, belief in the legal system, notwithstanding the way it's treated me.
My question is, after all that's been done to you, do you have any hope that at someday, either in private practice or in a big firm or working for an energy company, that you could ever assume your old position as a legal advisor?
From experience and the hundreds of jobs and the scores of agencies that I've used, the jobs I've applied for, would suggest that those days are gone, and I've come to terms with that now.
You've given up hope.
Right.
Would you tell a whistleblower today to not do it?
Obviously not. I'm walking, breathing. Quite how much longer, I wonder sometimes. Evidence of why the world is simply not yet equipped for corporate whistleblowers.
What needs to be done to protect whistleblowers?
Well, there needs to be robust, ideally international treaties and laws in place. I mean, this is farcical, what has happened to me. Reporting what needed to be put right, reporting injustice to justice. And by the way, people think bribes are, there's no one actually suffers. It's all really okay. It's just a funny way of getting to do business. But no, thanks to bribe payers, people are kept poor. People don't realise the repercussions of bribery. They think, it's just a few million here and there. But there are real repercussions.
Do you happen to know where the Monaco prosecutor is today?
Sylvia Petit something's her name. I think she's been promoted. I think she still works in government, but she's no longer the prosecutor.
If she walked through those doors...
SBM's one thing, but it's another thing them as well. Yeah.
What would you say to them?
Why the hell did you do that? Why did you do that? You were seeking to extradite me. I was fast-tracking, getting to the exact place where I would have otherwise been if you had succeeded in extraditing me, yet you wouldn't allow it to occur. On what basis did you do that? Other than pure and utter spite.
This is still fresh for you.
Oh yeah, because that decision was I could have. I was in a bad place, but it was rescuable at that moment. It really was. I could have gone back to my life, but I can't now. The life I had is simply no longer there. I could have, had she revoked that request for extradition. It wasn't too late. So that made all the difference in the world.
And if the SBM executives would walk through those doors today, if the head of compliance, you got to turn towards these executives in SBM, the floor is yours. 30 seconds.
Well, they were naive. They totally underestimated what could and did occur as a result of they're marginalising me for doing the right thing and advising on doing the right thing instead of not reporting to the relevant prosecutors like Brazil, and thereby elongating the whole process. Just took such bad advice. You'd made such stupid decisions. So right now, it's still not necessarily over for them. It was just dumbasses, really, really acting in a maddening, ill-advised way. Yeah, the cover-up so early. Just, you cocked up, guys. You really cocked up, and you're still suffering now. And now, very wealthy men. But look at you.
Jonathan, I really appreciate you sharing your story. This can't have been easy, but I appreciate you sharing it with the targeted audience.
Once again, you're very welcome. Thank you.
As Jonathan languished in Croatia, the country's Supreme Court upheld his extradition. But then at the last moment, Croatian Justice Minister Ivan Malenica denied the request. Finally, in October 2021, nearly a year after Interpol withdrew the Red Notice, Jonathan agreed to appear in Monaco for questioning of his own free will. By the following March, the case against him was dismissed. Monaco prosecutors tried one last appeal, but by October 2022, it was over. In 2024, Jonathan won damages from SBM in a Dutch court for labeling him a blackmailer. But the life he once had, that was gone forever. Today, very little of Jonathan's life is still intact. But maybe he'll be able to forge something new for himself by sharing his story. And his former employers will be forever marked by the wrongdoing he helped bring to light. As for other victims of targeting, the future is not so clear. While facing down a global corporation is formidable, staring a global superpower in the eyes without flinching is something else altogether. And next time, political activist and Nobel Prize nominee Nathan Law explains that doing so has implications that will follow you for the rest of your life. Targeted is a production of Next Chapter Podcasts. Please follow the show, subscribe, rate and review on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow me, Zach Abramowitz, on X at Zach Abramowitz, and subscribe to my Substack at legallydisrupted.com. To learn more about our guests and their stories, go to targeted.com.